When we say right for rights, people think, oh, can a pen really change a life? Can submitting a postcard, a letter, a comment, a word of encouragement to someone who is in prison for something that they allege they did not commit? Can someone who is facing trumped up charges, would they ever see justice? Can someone who has lost their lives or their livelihood as a result of fighting the injustices in their community, will they ever be acknowledged for the work and for their tireless service? So Right for Rights, as a flagship program for Amnesty International, brings the world together to address issues of great importance. This year, we are looking at various human rights defenders, mostly young people, as you can see, who are standing up in their communities and challenging injustice. When we gather together on human rights, the world listens, the world leaders pay attention. And while we are focusing on these cases today, it doesn't mean there are no other cases of importance. Every case of human rights violation is important. But we focus on these ones because we know the mobilization of a global movement can draw specific attention to these issues at critical time that these young people and human rights defenders are facing.
So, equality, reducing inequalities, advancing human rights. That's the theme for this year's Human Rights Day. It's not just a Nigerian thing, it's a global thing. And this theme for this year, which is reducing inequalities, advancing human rights, is sort of a reflection of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And that is something that is touted a lot. I mean, no government will come out and say, well, we're doing very bad when it comes to human rights. But when it comes to reality, there's still a lot of questions to be asked. And today we're taking time out to ask those questions. And we're focusing on specific areas which involve rights of the child, rights of women, rights of persons with disability, conditions of our prisons, which is a major one as well, and other detention centers, administration of criminal justice, torture, extrajudicial killings, which resonates a lot. I mean, you could recall the panels that were set up across the country. So, I mean, it's a tough task, really, to try to look into these things, but we'll do our very best to ensure that we at least throw up these issues and, put the responsibility at the right doors and ensure that hopefully they listen and do better when it comes to human rights. And this morning, we'll be joined by two guests. But you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm just... Two words came to mind as you spoke about human rights: soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure. Yeah. One of the infrastructures in place for protection of human rights is the security system. How strong is that to protect the security and welfare of any human being? That one is a question that we need to ask ourselves over and over again. And even the people who are supposed to help protect the human rights themselves, how strong are their own human rights as well? Questions are limitless, and I guess the least we can do is to continue to raise the issues.
Absolutely.
And draw the attention of the authorities to it.
So let's raise those issues now. We're joined on the program this morning by Ava Gaver, who is the Director, Human Rights Education and Promotion at the National Human Rights Commission. She joins us from our Abuja studio. As you can see, she's a lawyer, child rights expert, member, African Union Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Good morning, madam. Thank you for joining us on the program this morning.
Yeah, good morning. It's good to be here.
And we have joining us virtually Mr. Martin Obona, who's a human rights lawyer and advocate. He's the Executive Director, TAP Initiative for Citizens Development. He's a fellow for Alliance for Historical Dialogue and Accountability, Columbia University, New York. He holds an executive certificate on expanding impact of NGOs and public sector at Harvard Kennedy School. Mr. Ogbonna, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let me begin in Abuja. So the saying, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. I wonder for you how true that is in Nigeria. Yes, this is a global commemoration, but we're narrowing it down to Nigeria. How true is that statement in Nigeria as a measure of a human rights quotient?
Yeah, thank you. You just stated Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Basically, that is an aspiration. So I think what we need to look at is what has been done so far to meet that aspiration, which speaks to equality and the recognition of human rights. So I would say, even if we are not yet there, steps have been taken. And so what matters is what steps, what measures have been taken to fulfill that. And in Nigeria, I would say the starting point is always the legal framework. And so it involves a review of what our legal framework is, how much it supports a human rights system, how much it recognizes human rights. So it requires looking at the legal framework across all the sectors of human rights, in the areas of discrimination, in the areas of vulnerability, in the areas of access to water, education, health, and all the economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the other group of rights. So some steps have been taken. If we are going to measure, how much has been achieved, it takes a lot to review what has been achieved in Nigeria so far, but definitely steps have been taken, beginning with the legal framework, beginning with the establishment of structures for implementation of those frameworks. That's where we start.
Is it to say that we can't measure just how well we're doing, or perhaps you might want to share with us that measure? How well are we doing? Or are you saying that we can't tell how much we're doing or how well we're doing?
No, we can tell. We can definitely tell. That's why I say we start with what we have done in different sectors of human rights. For instance, in the issue of education, how much provision for education have we achieved? Because it talks that the universal basic education talks about, compulsory free education. How much have we done there? For provision of health, how much have we done there? So like I said, it calls for a review. It's work in progress. That's the kind of point I'm trying to make. So it calls for a review of what we have done by sector, how much access we have to water, we have to food, we have to, good roads, and what are the conditions between the urban and the rural communities, how deep are urban and rural disparities in these sectors, because human rights is supposed to be enjoyed by everybody, despite their social status, despite their religion, their gender, and all that. So we also need to have a review of how much human rights are assessed at the community levels and all of that.
So let me see how Mr. Ogbonna would rate our performance as a nation. And I say this as a nation, both government and the people. So, I mean, human rights in Nigeria is protected by the Constitution, the African Charter, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and other various treaties that we're party to. But for you, in terms of scoring Nigeria, Mr. Ogbonna, just how do you rate us?
Thank you so much. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Okay. So I would like to take it based on our own ground norm, which is the Constitution. The Constitution guarantees fundamental rights, And then I would like to take it one after the other. Let's take, for example, the right to life, the right to dignity of human person, the right to personal liberty, the right to fair hearing, the right to private and family, the right to freedom of expression and thoughts and even conscience and religion, the right to freedom of expression. Now, if you take this one after the other, and we begin to juxtapose that to see how we have fared fairly, how have we fared in terms of the right to life that is guaranteed by the Constitution, African Charter, United Nations Charter, and the rest of other international instruments and conventions. Now, in terms of right to life, what is the value of the Nigerian life? How has government fared in terms of protecting the lives and properties of citizens? We were just here the other day and we saw that a bus ran through children in Lagos State and killed all of them. What is the justice system in Nigeria that guarantees the right to life? How does even the law enforcement agents and agencies conduct themselves in terms of protecting the rights of citizens? Now we talk about the dignity of human person. How is the government, or how do we treat ourselves as people, as citizens of Nigeria? Am I happy in the morning waking up to know that I'm a citizen of Nigeria? If I travel from Nigeria to Gabon, if I travel from Nigeria to Canada, am I sure that if anything happens to me in those countries, my country will wake up and defend my rights? Am I sure that I'll be treated fairly as a citizen of Nigeria in terms of the fact that I have dignity as a human being? If, for example, something happens to me and I'm being arrested by the law enforcement, Nigerian police, army, whoever, would I be guaranteed that I would not face torture? Would I be guaranteed that I won't be stripped naked in handcuffs, put in front of cameras to be dehumanized? And so these are all the questions that we need to ask ourselves when it comes to rights to liberty, personal liberty. How are women treated in Nigeria? We woke up a few years ago to the consistent arrest of women on the streets of Abuja just because they are working or they're trying to just go and have a good time at night or have, join the nightlife and just be good, And we wake up to see that police arrest them, dehumanize them, and extort them and do all manner of heinous things to them.
Mr. Bono, pardon me to cut in now. Incidentally, this coincides with the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So it's quite instructive that you referenced that point. But we need to go on a break now. And when we return, I'll allow you land on that point. Now we'll take a look at the things we need to do. Where we need to look at to ensure that we uphold human rights even more. Do stay with us. Well, let's continue the conversation. So, Mr. Bono, you were making that point, and as you land on it, I'd like you to just add to it. You started from the grundnorm, which is the Constitution, and I said earlier that we're taking a look at this as a nation. So, I'm talking government and the people. We have laws, the Constitution that guarantees, those rights. We have the ACJ and a lot of others. But you see that in terms of operationalizing it, is it an agent of government or an individual, I should just say? They probably are not connected to those laws. So in terms, as you land on that point, I'd like you to also perhaps add to that point, that it seems to be a disconnect between agents of government, individuals, people like you and I, who are most times fingered when it comes to abuse of human rights. So why do we have that disconnect?
Okay, so based on what I was saying initially, in terms of the arrest of women and the justice system, and then the 16 days of activism that you mentioned. So essentially, I feel that the reason we have that level of disconnect is that is the level of enlightenment and the duty of care. Most of our security agents who are in the executive do not conduct themselves as though they really owe anybody a duty of care. And if you look at Section 17 of the 1999 Constitution, I think subsection 2, paragraph C, it talks about the actions of government must be very humane, must be humane. So somebody in government does not see himself as though he owes a duty of care to the average citizen or the Nigerian citizen on the streets. Everybody sees themselves as though they are overlords. And so, or majority of them see themselves as though they are overlords, including law enforcement agents in this regard. And so they do not carry out their actions and activities in a humane manner, which is already guaranteed in the 1999 Constitution. So I do not know whether it is a level of enlightenment or it is training or just sheer wickedness that makes us treat human beings with so much impunity in our country and violate the rights of Nigerian citizens. And people really do not know how extensive these violations go in terms of making citizens feel like they do not owe the country any duty as well. So if I feel like my rights aren't protected in Nigeria and that the state is not there to guarantee those rights, then I'll go about with a lot of other impunity. But we thank God somehow for our judiciary. You know, at some point, we are able to get some level of balance and justices. But I think we still need to do a lot more in that regard. You know, looking at the way justice is being delivered in the law courts in terms of fundamental rights enforcement and all that. I think we still need to do a whole lot in terms of connecting those dots. Let there be let security agencies carry out their duties, you know, with a human face, you know, and let them consider that particular section of the Constitution, Section 17(2)(c), that says that every decision of the government has to be humane. And the law enforcement are the first people, you know, that we interact with or interface with on a day-to-day basis beyond any other person, you know, more than any other person. So once they stay on the streets, once there are so many.
Yeah, my apologies. There are so many things that you have raised in the little response that you've given to my colleague's question. But let me take this to Ms. Gava now in Abuja. This Human Rights Day has been celebrated since 12 years before Nigeria's independence in 1948. And the objectives are clear. Raise awareness about people's social, cultural, and physical rights, and to ensure the welfare of everyone. In terms of infrastructure to get this done, madam, from the very beginning, even up until now, would you say that we have the structures strong enough in place to ensure human rights in our country?
No, I would just bluntly say we do not have enough. For instance, if you look at the Child Rights Act, there is an implementation committee within the Child Rights Act that it's composite, and it ought to be well capacitated. It ought to be well facilitated by way of a budget, you know, for it, and building of capacity of the members of that committee to be able to implement the Child Rights Act. And this cascades to all the child rights laws of the states. But you discover in the first place that this committee is not well supported to carry out that mandate. And then if you look at the Child Rights Act again, there are so many things that are not yet on ground. For instance, there are so many structures that ought to be in place, facilities to facilitate the implementation. For instance, places of custody for children. I'm just giving the example in the area of child rights. We do not have them on ground. And so we do not have, you know, a very friendly or an enabling environment to implement child rights adequately. And so it also applies to other sectors. This year's theme is around equality. And so it speaks to issues concerning vulnerable groups. Why are our women, you know, why do they appear more vulnerable? Why are they more vulnerable, you know, than maybe the men? Or why are persons with disabilities, you know, it seems disability is different when they do not have access to public spaces, when they do not have access to express themselves and to run a normal life. And then there is the issue of ignorance about human rights, you know. This is very far-reaching. It is very inherent. People do not know their human rights well enough to speak up or to protest, you know, a human rights infringement, you know, and to protect another person whose rights is being infringed upon. So even though we have been celebrating the International Human Rights Day for a long time, like you said, there still needs a lot to be done. You know, we need to have our institutions, our structures, all our mechanisms that promote human rights to have, you know, more capacity, more support. We need to have an increased deployment of, you know, budgetary resources to MDAs that are in one way or the other dealing with issues of human rights. Like I said, if it is an issue of education, we see it as a fundamental human right, then it ought to be well funded. And so we need to prioritize issues around human rights, you know, in our budgetary structure. We need to get people to know more about their rights. And we need to know, especially people who are like my colleague was saying just now, people in the security makeup need to know more about human rights, and they need to know more about how to carry out their operations, you know, in line with human rights standards. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. If I were to measure, I would say some progress has been made. Yes, some progress has been made. We've come a long way now, but more needs to be done. People need to know their rights more. People need to have the, you know, to be empowered to speak out against human rights violations and infringements on their person or on a third party.
Well, Mr. Obono, let me bring this to you, since Madam has also referenced a thing or two that you said. Let's look at the process of even enforcing or championing human rights. You've talked significantly, and so has she, about those who are supposed to help enforce the human rights of Nigerians. Now, this Human Rights Day has been on since like 1948, and a good number, a sizable number of all the policemen and all the apparatus of government that are enforcing, or rather supposed to facilitate the human rights protection in our country today at whatever level of government, none has been born at that time. A good number of them hasn't been born at that time. So I'm wondering how, in what way do you think we should, you know, I don't know, maybe coach them in, train them in to human rights and all those things? Because people who themselves haven't had their human rights protected get into a position of protecting other people's human rights, what's going to happen?
So I think it's not about how long, but it's also about how I wasn't born when all these things happened, but I've been able to know what is right and what's wrong. You know, so the police, the military must all have rules of engagement, and it's very important in terms of dealing with situations. The police officer who is on the streets, who interfaces with people on a daily basis, must have the rules of engagement. The military officer who is protecting our territorial integrity, who are patrolling our borders, must also have rules of engagement. From the point of recruitment, it must be very stated, it must be stated clearly that human rights is key to protection of lives and property. And that's what beats me most when I see the government.
Oh no, just 1 second.
General.
In terms of the rules of engagement that you mentioned, do you see it grafted into their training? Do you see any such manifestation?
Yes, it's not to be drafted in their training. From the time you get into the either police academy or you enroll in the Nigerian Defense Academy or you're being recruited, it has to be in their curriculum. You know, those rules of engagement must be spelled out clearly as to how to engage with citizens.
But that's the question I'm asking, Mr. Obono. That's the question
Yes.
I'm asking. Do you see such manifestation?
Well, I don't see such manifestations. We can't see it on the streets. You know, we deal with people who have human rights cases on a day-to-day basis, and we don't see that evidence. It's not manifested in the way law enforcement carry themselves on a daily basis. So there's a lacuna in that aspect. There's a need for training. there's a need for retraining. It's not just enough to start the training or from the point of entry, but there's also need for that retraining to continue. So for us to get to that level, there has to be constant reminder of these people that you owe citizens a duty of care to protect them, you know.
So let's go to our Abuja studio. I was going to say let's go to Abuja. We are both in Abuja, so to our studio in Abuja. And, you know, when we talk about human rights, yes, we reference a lot, and rightly so, the activities of, you know, some of the security agents that go out of line, you know, in terms of brutality and the rest. But I came across something quite important, and I know that this is an area that you are also vast in, and it's the economic, social, and cultural rights, which is enshrined in one of the covenants Nigeria is a treaty to. That's the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it essentially speaks about providing basic rights such as shelter, food security, education, access to health. Now, I'm saying this because, you know, part of the theme for this year's commemoration is reducing inequalities. And there's always a talk about the huge gap, you know, the huge poverty gap in Nigeria. I know there's a term in this setting that talks about progressive realization, but for Nigeria, really, in terms of ensuring those basic rights of shelter, food, quality health, and all that, where lies our challenge, really?
Where our challenge, in the first place, you have just said it. I think it lies, first of all, in that window that says economic, social, and cultural rights are realizable only subject to availability of resources. You know, so that lowers accountability, because that is a very subjective term. It is subject to a lot of interpretation. We don't know when resources are available. And, you know, even by way of terminology, it sounds as if that has already been downgraded. It can only be attended to when resources are available. And so it downgrades the position of economic, social, and cultural rights. But interestingly, economic, social, and cultural rights really are the crux of human rights. When we don't have access to health, to shelter, to food, these are issues that touch around human dignity and which strip any human being of their dignity. And of course, they are directly, there's the intersection with the right to life that we consider to be paramount, which is actually very paramount. But what is the right to life when you do not have right to food, when you do not have right to shelter, and you are exposed to a lot of hazards? And so the issue of availability of resources, you know, it raises very serious issues around accountability. And so it calls for strengthening of accountability, you know, across the sectors for those in power, and, you know, the fact that human rights must be provided. And so, and that's why for some NGOs, they have done a lot of work, and some have approached courts of law, you know, domestically and internationally on issues that involve, you know, provision of economic, social, and cultural rights. You know, right to economic resources for livelihoods are very important. And, you know, they define what dignity is. They define the right to life, you know, a right of, you know, an equal level of access to health, you know, it defines. And so it calls for more accountability. It calls for stakeholders, you know, to continue to monitor and to continue to ask and call for accountability at all levels, you know. There's a lot of work to be done in that area, you know, to give an interpretation to what availability of resources is, and to upgrade and step up these rights, you know, to economics, to civil and political rights, which are considered to be more fundamental. And so, like I said earlier, it's work in progress. All actors, all stakeholders must begin or must continue to call for accountability, to call for provision of economic, social, and cultural rights.
What are the consequences, madam, of not protecting people's human rights as enshrined in the laws? What are the consequences?
Well, the consequences are that, judicially speaking, people whose rights have been violated, you know, be it by law enforcement, or whose rights have been infringed upon or abused, even at domestic levels, are entitled to a level of compensation, a level of redress. Redress could come, by way of restitution, to bring them back to a certain state of life, for instance, as you have under the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, for instance, a girl child who has been violated maybe sexually and is supposed to be brought back to her state in life, maybe to be restored back to education. So the consequences involve a level of restoration, indeed total restoration, of what a person would have lost, and steps to be taken to restore their dignity, and their self-worth too. And sometimes it comes in the form of monetary compensation, which is much of the time ordered by a court of law, to compensate and pay damages to a person whose rights have been violated. As we have been saying, there have been a lot of mechanisms set up to look into activities of maybe law enforcement, and you see that much of the time it comes out with orders as to compensation. The idea here being to bring the person back to a state of their dignity and to a state where they recover what was lost. And so those are some of the, the measures that can be taken to address issues of human rights violation or human rights.
Okay, just before
abuse.
I go to Mr. Obono on Zoom, I just want to ask this one, and it borders on human rights as well, and it concerns. I'm sure you've seen the controversy that trailed the panel here in Lagos. I know that the NHRC also inaugurated a panel in Abuja that, of course, has been conducting proceedings. I believe proceedings resumed of recent. Is there any updates regarding that, and when can we expect maybe a paper, an eventual white paper? Because, all eyes essentially are on all the panels to see what will come out of it.
Yes, I can imagine. I quite understand that. Where the proceedings are ongoing, just like you said, and there's a lot of progress. Some orders have been made so far, but of course it's still ongoing. The hearings are still on. And it's a good thing, just like you said, it has resumed sitting, and it's going on right away. I couldn't have a precise impression of when the committee, it could come to a close, but I think maybe next year, maybe by next year, maybe early next year. I have not actually had a look at their case list, there, but by next year it should be coming to a close, considering the fact that, issues before that panel are very important and they are kind of time-bound, and time is of the essence because they affect the human rights of persons. And so to comment on the substance, of what is before the panel, of course, as you know, it's sub-judicial, but a lot of progress has been made. We have encountered, I have personally encountered people who were walking out because they had received maybe an order that they considered favorable. And so it's ongoing, and a lot of work is being done there.
As you said, time is of the essence, and we're winding down as well on the program now. So let me just end with Mr. Obono. So this day is being commemorated. There was one last year. There should be another next year, hopefully. But for you, what would you like to see change in terms of, and I'll say again, as a nation, government and the people, in terms of making commitment to ensuring that human rights are better upheld in the country?
Thank you. Basically, I'd like to quickly chip in something when you talked about the economic, socio-economic rights and the rights guaranteed under section, chapter 2 of the Constitution. So for me, basically, those rights are enforceable, they are justiciable. Usually what most people say is that the rights under chapter 2 are non-justiciable. That means you cannot enforce them when you go to court. But if you look at these rights individually and you subsume them with the rights to life, if you don't have food on your table, can you live? The question is no. if you don't have shelter, if you don't have security, if you're not provided with those basic provisions that are under Chapter 2, you can't live, you can't have right to life. So socio-economic rights are actually enforceable. If you cannot enforce them under Chapter 2, as it were, if you cannot subsume them differently under Chapter 2, you can actually enforce them under the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which has the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which then shows you that you have those socio-economic rights protected under the African Charter. Now, what can we do in terms of protecting the rights of people? I think we need to look at ourselves as human beings and be able to say that you care for one another. Basically, that is on a horizontal level. When I talk about horizontal level, I'm talking about citizens to citizens.
And now, I think that's a fantastic place
to
anchor, Mr. Ogbonu. I mean, care for one another across all levels. So I would like to thank you so much, Director, Human Rights, Education and Promotion, National Human Rights Commission, and lawyer Ava Gava. She joined us from our Abuja studio, as well as Mr. Martin Ogbonu, human rights lawyer and advocate, Executive Director, TAP Initiative for Citizens Development. Thank you so much for your thoughts as well. We do appreciate them.